Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to start our second session of the day. So welcome to anyone who's joined us new, and welcome back to anyone who's been with us since the start of the morning. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Joanna to begin the session on BC energy monitoring.
Thanks, Rianne. Thank you. I'll start sharing my screen now, so let me know if everything works. Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's my turn to welcome you to our session. We will now be moving into the second part of today's webinar, covering the Mayor's BC policy. My name is Joanna, and I'm a Senior Program and Policy Officer at the GLA's Climate Change Mitigation Team. Together with me today, we have Dominic Humphrey from UCL, who will be giving a part of today's presentation, focusing on the BC portal. We also have Robert Cohen from Verco. Verco has been assisting us throughout the project in the development of the guidance, and he's here to cover any questions that may arise. Today, I will be talking to you about the Mayor's BC policy, a truly innovative policy being introduced as part of the New London Plan, and which focuses on in-use performance of new buildings in London. In terms of what we will be covering, I'll be starting off with a bit around the policy's background and purpose. I will quickly touch on the development of the policy, and I will outline some key areas of interest from the BC energy monitoring guidance. Dominic will then take over and will walk you through the BC portal, including a short demonstration of the London building stock model, its relationship with the BC portal, and our reporting spreadsheet. So starting off with the background of the policy, as most of you will know, the Mayor has declared a climate emergency and has set a very ambitious target for London to be net zero carbon by 2030. New developments and the New London Plan in particular have a very pivotal role to play in pushing this zero carbon agenda forward, hence the importance we have all placed around planning. Unfortunately, the tools we currently have in hand, tools like the Part L of the building regulations and EPCs, for example, only provide us with an indication of the theoretical performance of how new buildings perform. To therefore bridge that gap between design and real-life operation, we have introduced the BC policy as part of Policy SI2 of the new intent to publish London Plan. Policy SI2 mostly represents the energy hierarchy, that is the Be Lean, Be Clean, and Be Green steps. We have now introduced a new fourth step under the existing hierarchy, the Be Seen stage, which requires all major developments to monitor and report on their energy performance for at least 5 years post-construction via GLA's portal. There are lots of aspects to the purpose of the policy, but it's first and foremost about understanding the actual energy and carbon performance of new buildings, which will also help ensure compliance with the net zero carbon target. As already mentioned, it's of course about assessing the scale of the performance gap and trying to bridge it, raising awareness over building performance and in-use monitoring, both for developers but also occupants. And finally, through the data that we will be collecting over time, having the potential to inform our future policy through the development of our own benchmarks. So what have we done during the time leading up to the development of the BC approach? We have had extensive stakeholder engagement with key organizations and groups in London who are doing work around post-construction monitoring. Through those roundtable discussions with BRE, UKGBC, LETI, Better Buildings Partnership, energy management companies, and London boroughs and corporations, we have had discussions to identify identify potential challenges that could inhibit our process. We also tried to understand the current metering arrangements and costs, and we finally received very valuable feedback on our proposed methodologies. We also carried out an in-depth research on all existing monitoring and reporting frameworks out there, and a very detailed optioneering appraisal before we made our final decisions. On the back of all this work, we developed the BSIN framework, which essentially includes the BSIN energy monitoring guidance and the BSIN portal. So as explained, I will be walking you through the guidance, and then we'll hand over to Dominic, who will be discussing the portal. The guidance is a publicly available document which sets out the requirements to comply with the BSIN policy. The first version of the guidance was published back in April 2020 for applicants to familiarize themselves with the process. The document that you can see on your left-hand side, and which is currently accessible through our consultation webpage, is the October 2020 consultation version. There are only minimal changes compared to the April 2020 document, none of those affecting the actual context first presented under the April document. It is important to note that the policy is applicable to all major developments, for example, anything more than 10 residential units and more than roughly 1,000 square meters, I believe, in non-domestic space. It is also good to note that our expectation is that applicants will follow the approach even before the formal London Plan publication. In the guidance, we have set out the responsibilities at each reporting stage for each responsible party. There are three key milestones: the planning stage, the S-Bill stage, and the in-use stage, where we ask applicants, developers, owners to submit the necessary data set out in the guidance. Particularly at planning stage, we asked for key basic performance data, but also confirmation of the upcoming target dates for each reporting stage. We also asked for confirmation that the metering plans which will enable the in-use performance monitoring and reporting will be implemented as part of each building's design. At S-Bill stage, roughly before the building is handed over, we ask for an update on the energy performance indicators with a bit more detail this time, but also that all essential metering arrangements are in place and correctly calibrated. Finally, at in-use stage, and for 5 years, once the first year of occupation has passed, owners will be expected to submit the actual energy performance data. And in those cases where this actual performance differs substantially from the estimates, they will need to identify the causes of this divergence and the potential mitigation measures that could improve the situation. Another thing we have introduced in the guidance is the concept of reportable units. It's actually a method of splitting the development in different smaller categories to set out tailored methodologies of monitoring and reporting data per different reportable unit typology. So what developers essentially have to do is split the development into reportable units and provide the necessary indicators for each of them. There's actually an entire section in the guidance, that's Appendix 2 of the guidance, where we have aimed to provide indicative examples of the most typical developments that could come forward and how they are to be split into reportable units, whether these are single-tenanted or multi-tenanted premises. Going into the indicators, here's a brief summary of the KPIs we require reporting against at the various milestones mentioned previously. Firstly, applicants will be expected to submit some key contextual data, information like the development location, typologies of buildings coming forward, and proposed gross internal areas. We also ask for information around the building energy use, such as the grid electricity or gas consumption, or in those instances where there's a connection to a district heating network, the heat imported by that network. At as-built and in-use stages, we also ask for predicted and actual deck grade and rating, which is also a means of extracting some of the information we already request and making the whole process a bit more straightforward. We also want to see data on the renewable energy generation on site, whether this is through solar PV panels or solar thermal panels. We want to understand if there's any energy storage equipment installed and what is its capacity, if there are batteries on site, for instance. We're, of course, after estimates on carbon emissions, mostly at planning stage, as we intend to calculate the emissions at the upcoming reporting stages through the energy info submitted directly to us. At planning stage, though, we're asking for carbon emissions estimates for residential and non-residential uses separately, the estimated carbon shortfall and the agreed carbon offset with the respective local authority. Finally, we're after certain information around plant performance, and mostly this affects communal systems. So information such as the efficiency of its technology, for example, having a centralized plant room with heat pumps and boilers, what is the efficiency of the heat pump and the boiler, the percentage of heat supplied by each of those technologies, and the distribution heat losses associated with the entire system. So hopefully this has given you a good insight of the key elements of the process and requirements presented in the guidance. Before I hand over to Dominic, it is very important to talk about our enforcement mechanisms. So we expect all applicants to study the guidance in detail at planning stage to familiarize themselves with the process and requirements. That's also the stage where we ensure that a commitment has been provided from developers that all buildings on site will be designed in such a way to enable post-construction monitoring through the necessary monitoring infrastructure, and that all BCN indicators will be submitted to the GLA's portal at the appropriate timings. Finally, we have also developed some draft legal wording that we have already shared with boroughs as a template, since we expect that all the above will be secured through the legal agreement between the local authority and the applicant, whether that's through the Section 106 or the condition schedule. This draft legal wording, in brief, sets out the responsibilities at the various reporting stages, as already mentioned, and also asks for applicants to justify any underperformance from the estimated and set out potential mitigation measures to rectify this. So handing over to Dominic now, who has a much more picture-heavy presentation on the BCN portal, which I'm sure you will enjoy. Obviously, the process methodologies that we have just gone through are critical in obtaining the right information and ensuring that the process followed is verified and the correct one. But the BCN portal will eventually be the very powerful mechanism that will create transparency around the energy and carbon performance of all major new developments in London. And on that note, Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. As Anna mentioned, my name is Dominic Humphrey. I'm from the University College London in the Building Stock Laboratory, and I'm going to briefly talk about the London Building Stock Model and then the BCN portal. The London Building Stock Model was commissioned by the GLA in 2018, and it was delivered in 2020, and it is available to the general public to view online. It is a floor level 3D model of each and every building in London, and as this screenshot shows, what's kind of unique about our model as a sort of digital twin of London is we know at a floor level what's happening at the building, and that is kind of, it spans a wide range of data points across London stock, and typically they're about anything up to 250 items per premises, per building, and these span sort of physical and occupancy characteristics, such as maybe height or building material or what's happening on that floor, or specifically the model's intended purpose was to look at energy and energy consumption in the built stock in London. So sort of some brief sort of stats from the model. It covers around 2 million self-contained units, and that is sort of analogous to a building in many cases, but in certain cases it could be where several buildings have merged or divided over time, as they tend to do with development and redevelopment. That covers somewhere in the region of 3.8 million unique premises, and that spans about 430 million square meters of floor space. And as these sort of diagrams or graphs on the page show, these are kind of the occupancy characteristics of the stock, as measured either by the count of premises or the floor area, and the coloured codes there run from classifying the stock by pure non-domestic use with a single tenant to pure domestic use with a single household. And then as a kind of more sort of breakdown, sort of give some example of the data that you can see within the London building stock model. And this is sort of looking at non-domestic use classified by that kind of commercial activity. And sort of the chart down there in the bottom right looks at just sort of pure non-domestic single tenant, and those just sort of office activity. And that shows that about 12% of all of London falls into this sort of categorization of a single tenant commercial building, and within that about 1.5% of London's entire floor space is office floor space, and that's across all 33 boroughs. This model was launched this summer. It's available at the moment online. The URL will be shared. This allows any person to go and click on any building and see a lot of these sort of data points that we've talked about, and part of the intention of the BScene was to show the BScene data in the context of the London building stock model, and the sort of behind the scenes both of these data sets will be closely interlinked, which is sort of drives some of the data points we ask to collect and the way that we link records to ensure that we're collecting the right record for the right building across time. So the BScene portal will be accessed through the existing web map that you can already get to, and sort of the intention of the portal is a place to collate energy performance data on top of the data that we already have within the London building stock model about a building, which so that comes from things at the moment like energy performance certificates or display energy certificates. It'll provide a single location to submit the data that you need to submit for the BScene. And for the public, that will kind of give them a way of sort of understanding which buildings are involved in the BScene and their level of compliance within that. And longer term, this is going to establish sort of post-construction monitoring as a good practice. And London's sort of unique in Britain, if not the world, in being sort of putting this data out there into the public and making it accessible. So at the moment, there's the primary way of submitting data to the portal is via an offline spreadsheet, so you don't have kind of concerns if you're filling in lots of data points that the system might kind of suspend or crash and you'll lose your data. You'll fill it all in offline as and when you want to, and then email and upload it to the portal. Longer term, we could also offer an online lodgement system, be something similar to a web form, and we'd be interested in collecting some feedback on that point. So what I'm going to talk through now is the current offline spreadsheet system. So at the moment, you'll go to the BScene webpage, you'll be able to download this spreadsheet, and that's available now. And within the spreadsheet, there are some instructions, but I'm just going to give you a quick sort of run through the data you need to provide and how the spreadsheet works. You need to provide one spreadsheet which contains the whole BScene process, so that's sort of each stage of reporting is all within this one spreadsheet, and then you can upload that one each time, and our system behind the scenes will kind of extract out the data for the specific stage. The spreadsheet uses macros, and part of that is to avoid users having to repeat the work and the data they're putting in, so as to make it more user friendly. And as a sort of there's only one sheet that you need to input data in, and that is the input data tab, and you only put data into yellow or blue cells, but I will step you through an example spreadsheet now. So as I said before, you need to put in data in the one sheet, which is input tab. When you first get to that sheet, as the top image shows here, you'll be asked to select from the list which stage of the BCN policy you are submitting for. And that means that in many cases, once you've submitted for the initial planning stage, when you go to the next stage, you'll find that the broad majority of the film's already completed, because things like the contextual data about the site are already inputted, but you can, if they have changed slightly between stages, you can update them, and those changes will then be carried forward. And as I said, sort of to make this slightly more user-friendly, we use macros, and part of that will check the data you're putting in that it's valid, so that you don't have the problem that you submit data and there's a sort of typo or an error within the sheet. And it also means that you can see how far each data sheet you've got through, so there's this sort of progress bar running along the top. And then, as I sort of mentioned here, this is sort of moved from planning to as built, and you see that we get some different data points here, and we fill those in, and we can see here on the second one that when we start that sheet, it's already 90% completed, because it's copied through the data from the first planning stage, so we don't have to re-input that data. So we just put in the kind of last 10% that's specific to the as built stage. And then that same process applies for the kind of in use stage, and there's some macros there that allow you to copy addresses through each stage seamlessly without having to copy and paste and sort of omitting any problems that might happen through sort of user errors. So that is quickly how the spreadsheet works. And then when that's completed, at the moment, that's a return by email form. But as we discussed before, this might change to sort of a more fully online system in due course. So once that data is submitted to us or to the GLA, it then goes up onto a server, and then the data that you put into the spreadsheet is then sort of extracted and checked. And then once that has sort of been through, some of those data points will then become the data that is used to populate the map. So that returns back to the kind of the map we have at the moment. So there will be a new data layer on that with a sort of limited subset of the data that goes into the spreadsheet that you provide. And that's kind of tailored to what we think is of sort of public interest and the sort of BCN policy objectives. So at the moment, these 4 fields will be a sort of a summary of developments, that sort of contextual data about where the development is, the number of units, the mix of uses within development, and then the energy emissions projected and actual, and then some sort of details on the energy system used and sort of things like renewable, how it's heated, and where the electricity comes from. And that is split between domestic and non-domestic. So this is yet to go live, so we're still working on the design here, but this will essentially be an extra layer on the existing map. So on the existing map on the left-hand side, you have these data panels that kind of allow you to look at different layers at the same time. So you'll be able to compare the BCN data with some of the existing data layers we have on the map. So you'll click that on, and then the individual developments will be represented by points, and those will be color coded based on the stage of BCN they're sort of currently within. And there'll also be a link on that page that takes you back to the landing page that gives you all the sort of policy guidance and the wider objectives of the BCN policy. So then when you click on one of these points, you will get those sort of selected key data sets that we mentioned, and this again is sort of the design is in development, but this is sort of a mock-up to show you what kind of thing you might get when you click on a development. So if there's one reportable unit or multiple reportable units, it looks slightly different. And on this one here, sort of is just showing the sort of overview for the whole development for all units, whether residential or non-residential. And as you can see, that you could tab through to see those different data points that we've discussed. And that's kind of a brief intro into the portal.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you very much. And of course, thanks to all for joining and listening and staying with us. Hopefully, you have found this quite useful. We're more than happy to hear your thoughts on what was presented today on Be Seen. You can complete the consultation survey on the link provided by the 15th of January 2021. There are also email accounts available if you want to get in touch. And the session is being recorded, so there will be a link to it available in YouTube shortly. We're more than happy now to take any of your questions. We should probably have roughly 30 minutes left for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, presenters, for that presentation. I think we'll now move on to the Q&A session. There's been a few that have come through already. So I'm going to kick off with this one. Our client is being asked to commit to Be Seen reporting stages. However, there's not appear to be any draft model planning conditions, so we're uncertain how this commitment is achievable and will meet the 6 tests replanning conditions. You mentioned draft legal wording has been shared with LPAs. Is this available? As the guidance is still under consultation, can you advise what is expected at the current time? Joanna, if you could come back on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Rhian. So yeah, as I mentioned, we have already shared draft legal wording with local authorities, and we've held similar sessions with London boroughs and London councils to make them aware of our requirements. We're more than happy to share these with applicants as well. We appreciate it's just a template, and there's likely to be negotiations between the legal teams of the borough and the applicant. It's just that we want to secure all the requirements set out in the guidance through appropriate legal wording, whether that's Section 106 or conditions. And on the aspect of the guidance is still in consultation and what is expected at the current time. So we need to probably mention that there's been extensive stakeholder engagement, and that means that we have built some consensus around the methodologies that we have set out. It's likely there will be some changes that will depend on the feedback we receive. But for the time being, we expect applicants, at least for the first few stages, which is planning mostly, and potentially S-Build, although it's quite early for S-Build information, to provide the information as outlined in the guidance.
Thanks very much. Okay, another question, quite technical one. Are you expecting metering drawing schematics at stage 2? This is quite detailed information at this stage that might not be available.
Yeah, so I'll start with that, and maybe Robert, you can carry on if I've missed anything. So I would say that at stage 2, which is roughly the planning stage, we don't expect for actual schematics. What we expect from applicants is a confirmation that metering will be in place to enable in-use monitoring, and that's the priority for us. And then when we go into the S-Build stage, which is close to stage 6, I would say, then that's where we need more firm confirmation that the metering is in place, and potentially even schematics uploaded to our portal. Robert, is there anything?
Yes, at the as-built stage, hopefully also sort of confirmation that the metering has been commissioned and calibrated.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. Another question, how long will it be before the Be Seen policy is applied to existing building stock instead of just new developments?
That's a good question, actually. So the policy strictly applies to all new major development. That doesn't mean, for instance, that our portal doesn't allow for refurbishments as well to be included. So if we're talking about major refurbishments that are submitted as a planning application, we expect that information could be submitted on that. In terms of the existing building stock, that's certainly something we can think of as part of the next phases of the policy and how it is being developed. We appreciate there are new requirements being put out there. It might be quite difficult to retrofit existing buildings if needed, to provide the information set out in the guidance. But looking at how the policy is received and evolves, it's certainly something that we can think of, because we're committed to achieving net zero carbon in London for all buildings. Yeah.
I think perhaps if I could just input there on just the powers point as well. So the mayor's powers are limited to new build. So we're able to do a lot with our new build policies in terms of net zero carbon buildings, the new Be Seen policy, the whole life cycle carbon policy. Unfortunately, our powers don't extend to existing buildings. You know, cities like New York do have those sorts of powers, are able to do lots of things with their existing building stock. Unfortunately, we don't have those powers, but we do have various kind of lobbying arms of government. We have our own energy efficiency delivery programs to do as much as we can with the funding that we've got to improve those buildings as far as possible, and to move in the direction of what we're trying to do with new build, you know, reducing the performance gap, making buildings perform as they should be. But yeah, the powers aspect is a challenge there.
Thank you all. Next question, how will gaps in reported data be dealt with? For example, closed metering and billing systems and faulty or poor comms from sites.
Robert, is this one you want to take on?
So the reporting of performance in the 5 years after occupation is based on pre-processing. The implication of this question is there's some sort of direct link from the sites to the portal, but there's an intermediate step where the data is processed on site or by the occupiers and then uploaded. So fundamentally, they would have to, the people on site would have to deal with missing data, 40 meters, etc.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Robert. And I would add that the responsibility for providing the data lies with the legal owner of the building or the development, and that is the expectation. We're of course trying to come up and think of ways where that process can be made much more automated. And again, we would welcome your views on that based on the roundtable discussions we had while we were developing the policy. This is an element that came up. At the same time, we don't want to limit developers to implement certain metering on site. There might be organizations or bodies or FM parties that they're already working with. So it's striking the right balance between specifying what needs to be in there and giving the freedom to developers to choose the best way to comply with the policy.
Thank you both for that. Next question. In the future, where targets are set using Be Seen, would there be penalties where a scheme does not achieve the targets identified? If so, how is this justified, as a scheme may undergo a change in proposed use by the occupant, e.g. longer opening hours of an office building?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question. It's sort of a two-scale question. I would say the first is about penalizing developers and the other is about setting targets. So I would start off with the point around penalizing developers. It's very important to understand that the purpose of the policy is not to penalize developers just for the sake of it, or because we know that at planning stage tools are probably not as representative of reality are being used, like Part L. The purpose of the policy is to actually achieve net zero carbon buildings, get as close as possible to very, very efficient buildings and try and understand the performance gap. So that means that the priority for us would be making sure that the building performs as efficiently as possible. We, of course, allow in our Be Seen reporting spreadsheet some comment boxes where we expect applicants to explain whether there's in cases where there's a divergence from in-use performance compared to the estimated performance. Explain the reasons for that. There could be multiple reasons for that. It could be because the estimate, the tool that has been used for the estimates at planning stage is not as accurate, but it could be because there hasn't been good maintenance or installation of buildings, and there are tweaks that could be made to improve the building. So it's more about that. It's more about ensuring that we have good buildings operating and assessing that scale of performance gap. And it's not so much about penalizing. And I would also say on that, in terms of, it's not just about penalizing developers, it's also about, we're trying to think how can we reward developers that are actually operating buildings in a very, very efficient way, and that could be done through the portal also. And finally, on the target part of the question, I would say similar to the whole life cycle approach, I would say it's quite early to develop benchmarks or targets. For us, the priority in the next couple of years is to collect as much information as we can. We expect that that is going to be mostly around planning and S-build, because there's a time gap between going through planning and in-use operation. But when we have a substantial sample available to report on, targets is the next step of our policy and benchmarks. And we'll have to see then how we approach that in terms of in-use performance comparing to those targets.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think there's
just a quick thing to add there, that I completely agree that it's very early for thinking about targets, let alone penalising. But one of the aspects of BC is, certainly for non-domestic buildings, to encourage people to predict a DEC rated display energy certificate rating, and to motivate occupiers to achieve that in practice. And of course, the DEC process does allow for things like hours of use. So targeting a rating does allow some sort of contingency for unexpected behaviours in reality, compared with on completion of the construction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The top question at the moment is one that I guess it's related, and I'm not sure how well this sits within our current planning system, but are there any vehicles which are being proposed for non-compliance where a building does not submit the data for the full 5 years? So does it make sense for the developer to pay money to the GLA, which is then paid back to the developer per year on submitting their energy data? There needs to be some sort of stick, ideally.
Yeah, that's a very clever question. It's something that's been on our mind for quite some time while we're developing the policy and the methodologies. And as Anne-Marie said, our powers lie with the planning system, and that's what we're trying to do through the legal wording that we have developed. And we expect that to be part, hopefully, of the Section 106 agreement rather than the conditions, because it's easier to discharge conditions and move on. We also expect that the responsibility when a building is sold on or passed over to someone else is clearly captured. The responsibility of monitoring and reporting to the GLA is clearly captured in those legal agreements between the various owners. We're hoping we won't have to result to any strict measures on asking developers to provide the data they should be providing to us. That's one of the reasons why on our basin reporting spreadsheet, we ask for estimates of the upcoming milestones and reporting stages, so that we can send reminders to developers to provide us with that data. It's also very important to keep in mind that this is a very important policy that eventually will help the GLA, but also developers reduce costs, advertise their developments on the portal. So it's not just a matter of providing the data to us for the sake of providing it. It's going to help the industry, not just the GLA, it's also developers and consultants. So we hopefully expect cooperation from most of the developers in London.
Mm-hmm.
It will be transparent on the portal as well.
Yeah.
If it's reached the in-use stage, that the data's not there.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you. So the current top question, I think we've probably covered this about, you know, if buildings are sold and doesn't meet policy, so the new owner can't comply, who would be accountable and how would they report it? I suspect maybe we've already covered this, but I don't know if anyone's got anything to add.
Yeah, I would say that I more or less covered that in my previous answer. It's very important that this is a legal requirement that will be secured through the agreement between the local authority and the developer. So every party needs to be made aware of their responsibilities. We also expect and we appreciate that there might be other teams involved in the process. It's not necessarily always the owner who understands everything about how the building works. It could be facilities management teams or engineers at different stages. So everyone needs to be fully aware of the requirements, and that responsibility needs to be passed on. But eventually, the onus lies with the legal owner. So that's it.
Thank you. Next question, is the methodology underpinning the stock model available so that others are enabled to create top models of their own locations? This would be a reasonable ambition for others to have, or does it have, does it require access to facilities that are generally not available? I think, is this one coming to you, Dominic?
So yeah, thanks for your interest, Michael. Yes, we've published a number of academic papers on how we put together our models, including one specifically on the London building stock model, which is posted in an open access journal. So I'll pop a link in the chat, and yeah, you'd be more than welcome to read more about it there. In terms of sort of the second part on whether it's a reasonable ambition for others to generate similar stock models, potentially some of the data sets within the model are paid and some of them are slightly restricted. For if you're building a whole city, it's computationally quite an expensive thing to do because you need to understand the spatial relationships both within and between buildings. The good news there is that UCL is in the process of building the equivalent model for other cities in the UK. So yes, hopefully that answers your question, and I'll pop the link in the chat for the paper.
Thanks very much. The next question, hopefully quite straightforward. Does the Be Seen spreadsheet need to be submitted alongside the energy statement or after the planning consent is granted?
Yeah, so what we strictly ask is that the spreadsheet is submitted after consent is granted. This is more because during the determination of the application, there could be minor changes in terms of the strategy of the emissions or the anticipated energy consumption, so that applicants don't have to do the same work twice or 3 times. They're definitely, they should be aware at planning stage that these are the requirements against which they need to provide information, but we would expect it to be submitted once consent is granted.
Thank you. Got a question on TM54 here. So that TM54 is referenced in the guidance as an appropriate tool for simulation at planning stage. What is the GLA expectation on design stage simulation modelling for Be Seen? A residential-led referable development will currently just use NCM software. Requiring TM54 will be quite an uplift in time and cost at planning stage.
Yeah, Robert, I'll probably start with that one, just to clarify that the TM54 requirement currently applies only to non-domestic buildings, not residential buildings. So we appreciate that it could be a higher significant cost uplift because you have to build a model from scratch. But particularly on non-domestic, it's a very important requirement for us. It helps developers understand better how their building could perform the estimated demand. It helps also with plant sizing. We feel it's good practice to do it. So that would be the expectation. Maybe in the future, depending on what we'll see as feedback from the submissions, we will apply it also to domestic, but it's not something that exists at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, is that okay? Was there anything?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, I think TM54, it's an established methodology for non-domestic, and is the way to capture the whole building energy use, which is not well done in the compliance calculations.
Potentially sort of a related question is, do you expect TM63 to be used at the in-use stage?
Yeah, so I believe TM63 is a new CIPSI guidance that was just published together with TM61 around post-occupancy evaluation and use performance. It's not expected to be used at this stage, so the methodology is as set out in the guidance. We're speaking with CIPSI, and CIPSI was also very vocal attendee of our workshops, so we'll have more discussions with them to understand exactly how that would differ from our existing guidance, and it might be something that's adopted later down the line, but not for the time being.
Okay. I've been drawn attention to another related question that's popped up in the chat. Any plan to replace TM54 with neighbours?
Yeah, so this is something that has been outlined in the guidance as a good practice suggestion for offices that are above a certain scale. We're also speaking with Better Buildings Partnership, and Robert has been heavily involved in the development of that methodology, design for performance methodology in the UK as well. So we're fully aware of the requirements. So we certainly support it. It's a methodology and a framework that we certainly support. We haven't at this stage made it mandatory because of the costs associated with it. But in those instances where larger office buildings undertake this assessment, it's very easy to replicate the requirements through submission of the DFP outputs to us rather than providing us with individual data as per the spreadsheet. It's similar with a DEX approach. If you we expect you to carry out a deck and you submit the XML file, and then we'll work out the outputs. Similar with the DFP, the neighbors approach. That's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, neighbors.
Yeah, just to add that in the guidance that there's an option for larger offices, which are specified as over 5,000 square meters net area. You have the option to predict and report a neighbours-based building rating as opposed to a deck for the whole building. That's a multi-let building. And shameless plug that next Thursday, 26th of November, BBP is launching the Neighbours UK rating scheme. And you would be able to join that online if you wish.
Right, thank you. There's one remaining question, but it's got a link in it. I don't think it's something we can answer in this session. So I think without any further questions, I'm going to draw the session to a close. Huge thanks to all of our speakers and panelists today, and thank you for attending, everyone, and asking all your questions. Really encourage you to have a look at the documents and the associated spreadsheets and templates if you haven't already, and please let us know what you think by filling in the surveys. We've put links to the guidance pages in the chat, so yeah, please do have a look and let us know what you think. Thanks everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.